What's up, y'all? Welcome into a special edition of the Cover 3 podcast. This is the college football lunchtime hangout. If you saw my video on Sunday, I was a little Jordan flu game-esque. Feeling better. Voice is not all the way better. Really appreciate everybody coming on here and dropping their questions and comments in the live chat. But, guys, it is really close to National Signing Day. We are smack dab in the middle of the coaching hot seat, hiring, firing, job search season. And who better to bring on than my friend from 24/7 Sports, Cooper Patagna, national recruiting analyst, guy who started his career at Alabama when Saban got there, has worked at Cincinnati, Washington, and Oregon. And, I mean, the guy knows prospects. He knows coaching. He knows it all. Cooper, man, welcome to the show.
I appreciate you having me, bud. It's awesome being here, man. Excited about it.
No doubt, man. So it's just kind of fun back and forth, a little lunchtime chat. For everybody listening at home or watching, obviously, we will just go through a couple pre-planned topics here that y'all have sent in, and then we'll open it up and we'll pick the best ones from the comment section. So, Coop, first thing I wanted to talk to you about here is some of these job openings, and one I wanted to bring up is one that you know pretty well, obviously, having worked there for multiple years, multiple really successful years, and that's the University of Washington. Obviously, fans from all over the country may have very different opinions on how good of a job Washington is. I know we brought this up briefly on Cover 3 the other day. Like, where do you see this job? I mean, if you're a coach out there who doesn't have maybe pre-existing connections to any part of the country, is this for like a top 10, a 20, a 30 job for you? Where do you see this at?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if you kind of rewind the clock a year and a half before they hired Jimmy Lake and you look at the program and evaluate it as a whole from where Chris Peterson left it to where it is now, just a short year and a half year later, Jimmy Lake only coached 13 games in his tenure. And I think that is something that you need to bring up because I think the job in terms of how you look at it from a coaching landscape and how a coach may view it is different than it would be a year and a half ago. In a program that we mentioned, Bud, before we got on the show, when 3 straight New Year's Six bowls before winning 8 games in Peterson's last year and winning a Vegas bowl. So obviously what they had done is capitalize off of USC being down. They had been toe-to-toe with Oregon, although Oregon had the better of them recently. So I think it's a good job. I think it's a job when Peterson was there, especially his last couple of years, you saw a team that was consistently in the top 20 in terms of recruiting rankings. And I think that's operating at a really high clip for them. I think the highest you could probably go there in terms of their ceiling would be just outside of the top 10 in terms of recruiting. So I see it really kind of as a top 15 to 20 job. It's a really good job. It's a unique place in the city of Seattle. I kind of call that like a NFL city. It's kind of different. It's got a little bit of an attraction to it being up there in the Pacific Northwest, and no shortage of resources being there. I think they do a really good job in terms of their salary pool with their staff and their support staff. So I think with the right guy, it can be a really good job.
That was something I wanted to bring up, Coop. So we hear this from USC and from Miami, like, hey, it's great to be in an NFL city, right, and have that pro mentality there. But you can afford to pay your head coach and your assistants and your coordinators. But does your staff photographer, does all your recruiting analysts, do those guys can Washington pay them enough to where they can live a reasonable lifestyle reasonably close to where they work? I know at USC that's a huge challenge that Clay Helton has discussed openly. In your experience working there, are those folks compensated at a level to where you can keep good people?
Yeah,
Seattle's not cheap.
Yeah, I think the foundation is there for sure, but I think the conversation needs to continue to exist. And I think the people, whether it's at the helm of the head coaching ranks or the athletic director and Jen Cohen, those are conversations that need to continue to happen in terms of funding to your program to compete at a national level. The game continues to change at a rapid pace. LSU is probably going to set the bar here in terms of what they're going to pay their next coach, depending on who that is. Scott Woodward did that at Texas A&M, and he did a really good job of that at Washington. So I think they have to continue to push the envelope, and it's all about how they see themselves. Do you see yourself on a national platform, or do you just want to contend in the Pac-12? And whatever that answer is going to dictate really how they see support staff infrastructure and how they're going to pay these guys.
For sure. So recruiting area wise, right? Obviously, I know you think Washington's a really good job. When you were in that recruiting office, how did y'all define your recruiting turf? Were you sort of like I know Dabo talks about the 4-hour radius there at Clemson, and they spot recruit the state of Florida. What were you guys' kind of guiding principles as far as the recruiting geography to bring enough talent to Washington to make a playoff game as you guys did?
Sure. I think that the area recruiting first and foremost was where the emphasis was in terms of Chris Peterson. And he was a big believer in relationships, in developing relationships and cultivating relationships. And he did a really good job of understanding the footprint of Seattle and Washington, and maybe some areas of the country that were a little bit more attracted. So I think it was heavy West Coast. You saw Northern, Southern California, obviously areas that Washington did a really good job in. I think kind of in the later years of Chris Peterson, I think Las Vegas, Nevada, you kind of get in these areas of Utah, which is a really kind of, more of a area that you have to focus in on, but has a good abundance of talent there, especially on the West Coast. And then it kind of got into the territory of like bigger bodies don't grow on trees on the West Coast. They come at a premium, right? So how far do you extend yourself to where you're not overextending yourself in terms of recruiting? So I think that's when you see schools like Washington traditionally get into the state of Texas and go into Houston or go into Dallas, and coming off of 3 straight New Year's Six Bowls. That was a good sell. And you're not going to beat Texas. You're not going to beat Texas A&M. But when it came to TCU, when it came to Baylor, when it came to Oklahoma State, when it came to some of these second-tier Big 12 programs, you had a pretty good case. But I still think you had to find the right fit and the right type of guy that was attracted to maybe the academia of Washington and Seattle and what that space and university really offered. But I think he did a really good job of that. I think the question would have been, if you're trying to go from good to great, there was still some opportunity out there. Like, your margin of error is super slim, right? Because everybody on the West Coast is recruiting for those big bodies. So the advantage, and Mario Cristobal has figured this out, if you're keeping guys at home on the West Coast, the big bodies, not only is that an asset for you and your program, but you're taking it away and diminishing that demand for everybody else. So it's a difficult job, but I think it's one of those jobs, if you come in with the right headspace and a plan, you can be successful.
That is certainly a zero-sum game with those big bodies there on the West Coast. And I know I've done some studies back in my days at SB Nation showing the number of players, specifically defensive linemen, that were 270 and above in the high school ranks, has been decreasing year over year for about 12 years. And so that's not a great sign for some of these West Coast teams. That's a pretty specific formula that you have to follow there. Obviously, Washington is not coming off, back-to-back BCS or New Year's Six type bowls now, but it's certainly capable of being built back up to that level with the right hire. I always think about, we talk, hey, how much does the new coach have to understand the recruiting landscape, and how much can he learn it? For instance, when Urban Meyer got hired at Florida, he had basically no experience recruiting in the state of Florida, and he learned it pretty quick, right? Now, it helped that he got to recruit against like late stage Bobby Bowden and Larry Coker / early stage Randy Shen, and then he built that thing up really well. With Washington, there's all those dynamics you just mentioned. You also have to have somebody who has good relationships with the poly community, obviously, to get some of those big bodies. When they're looking for a coach, how much do you value understanding of the recruiting landscape, and what's the learning curve here? Is it somebody like, could you get somebody from the East Coast to come in there and just explain it to them and they get rolling, or how long do you think it would take?
Yeah, I think there's so much opportunity on the West Coast. When you look at it, I mean, like, we were talking about this the other day. I was on a podcast, and yesterday, and we were talking about the Pac-12. And you look at the Pac-12, Oregon's sitting at number 9, right? They've kind of shown their recruiting chops under Mario Cristobal. They're the outlier. Stanford inside the top 20 right now, in the top 15, but that hasn't been a consistent product. And then the third ranked class is one win Arizona at 36, which kind of shows what the Pac-12 landscape is in terms of recruiting. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. What I would say to that is, I think it's more important for a coach to come in and have a plan in terms of what the vision is going to be like in terms of geographically, in terms of recruiting. And I think understanding the brand, I think that's really important. Washington carries a really strong brand on the West Coast. But you start to extend into Texas, it's not the same, So, and I think you have to understand that. You have to have a really good comprehension of that. So, like, there wouldn't be any issue with me if you went outside the box, hired a coach from the East Coast, outside of the Pac-12 or the Mountain West footprint. It would just be more prioritizing recruiting, understanding that there's an opportunity there, and what the plan is, A to Z, from the identification to the evaluation process to the execution process of it. Much like you talk about Urban Meyer, I think that's pretty similar. I think it's more about the person and the development of relationships over time, and then following a plan and executing a plan.
That's really interesting. I know, I read all these media reports. Hey, like they're looking at this guy, they're looking at that guy. It does seem that there's a geographic focus. East Coast schools generally look at guys who have recruited, on the East Coast or in the South or, out West. But I think some of these schools could be missing an opportunity to look at guys from all over the place if they can find, the right dude. I mean, Cristobal had never been out West, right? For Oregon, and it seems working pretty well there.
Yeah, like he understands that process. Like I talked about it. Like he just has a different mentality. Him coming from the SEC, even in his time at Florida International. I mean, it was different. Like it was all about recruiting. And there's two ways to kind of look at it. There's a lot of coaches that look at it in terms of cultivating a locker room, development of talent, and then personnel. So they kind of look at themselves as the X factor in terms of that whole process. And then there's coaches who are still very good football coaches who understand the value of putting personnel first and prioritizing personnel, and personnel being emphasized at a level that it's a non-negotiable and it's something that you do every day. And those are the schools that we have found have had an extreme amount of success, especially in the playoff era. I mean, if you look at all the top teams in the country right now, Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, obviously having a little bit of a down year, Ohio State, but these teams who have had sustainable success are teams who prioritize personnel and put it first in everything that they do in their day-to-day operations. So I think that's really important. And like with Washington, we talked about like, what are the goals there? Are your goals to compete at a national level, or your goals to compete for Pac-12 titles? And that more than likely is going to dictate what type of hire they make.
Absolutely. And I think the timing of this is pretty important as well. I mean, Arizona State could still open depending on how long they want to continue to, basically just put the hand up to the NCAA and fight the allegations there. USC did open, and that help. We don't know if Oregon could open up as well, possibly. So I think getting the right hire this time around is certainly something that is going to be really important for that program. Really important. PGH Jake wants to know, can we adjust my man's mic so it's not stabbing him in the neck?
That's how I like. I mean, can you hear me?
Jabbing you in the neck?
No, man. Oh, it does look like it's jabbing in the neck. Sorry about that.
Painful?
No, I mean, it's not painful. It's fine. We might have to live with it for right now.
Guys, I talked to Cooper on the phone. This is his voice, by the way. It's not neck adjusted. Hopefully
the audio is not bad.
Oh man. All right, guys. So next kind of canned topic here that Adam Lee says Washington's goal is hopefully to pull their heads out of their butts. Yeah, that'd be solid. Awesome. All right, this is one we'll take towards the end of the show. Mark, I kind of like this, which hired, fired coaches could be good coordinators as a bounce back opportunity. There's certainly a lot of them out there. All right, next one I wanted to bring up here, Coop, is TCU is seen as a really good job in the coaching community. Like that's one, almost like a Georgia Tech. When it opened, they're going to get a whole lot of interest from qualified coaches because guys see some intrigue of that job. And one thing I noticed in the comment section last Tuesday, and then also when that job opened, people were like, it's not that good of a job. We had Texas Tech fans telling us Texas Tech was a much better job. And they don't really have a huge fan base and not a huge history of success. And the feedback I got from guys I know in the coaching world was like, that's a really good job, man. So I want to ask you, and I probably just biased your answer here, but I know I didn't because we talked beforehand. Where do you put TCU as a job nationally?
Yeah, I mean, coincidentally enough, from what we just talked about, kind of in that same range as Washington, right? Kind of like in that 15 to 20 range, but it's a great job. You talk about Fort Worth, and then I think you kind of look at the dynamic of Oklahoma and Texas leaving the Big 12, and it kind of leaves this big vacancy in recruiting, right? In terms of like, okay, who is going to be that program in the Big 12 that's going to take over? And I don't expect any team in the Big 12 to really compete within the top 10, but it's kind of like that middle market that makes a lot of sense. And, Sonny Dykes is a name that we'll talk about. He's done an exceptional job in Dallas. And I think that there's this vacancy that's really going to depend on where they go in terms of the head coaching search. That's going to reflect what they do recruiting wise. And I mean, we look back at some of TCU's, most successful teams and what they've had offensively. I remember Jamar Chase, when I was at Michigan, wanted to go to TCU. That was the spot. Like that's where he wanted to go. Ended up getting pulled off the network before, he made a commitment, ended up at LSU. So what they've done at the skill position there, what they've been able to attract from a quarterback standpoint, I think you just look at the state of Texas and it makes so much sense. It's a really good job. I like personally a job in my world that I've been infatuated with for a really long time for a lot of different reasons. But I'm super intrigued to see what direction they go.
So just looking at our database earlier, I'm pretty confident in saying that the Dallas, metro area is easily one of the top 10 most talented areas in the entire country for college football talent, and maybe top 5-ish even, right? I mean, at Atlanta, depending on if you break up like Miami and Lauderdale and Palm Beach, or if you just kind of make it, one huge area, but like Dallas has more talent than an Orlando or than a Tampa, in my opinion, certainly more than like a Jacksonville. LA has a whole bunch, obviously, but like that is, if you can be a successful program in that market, and you can basically say, why not us? Because without Texas, without Oklahoma, there's nobody in the new Big 12, not Cincinnati, not UCF, who should routinely out recruit you, right? Like you can say, hey, if we make the right hire, we can have the most talent in the new Big 12. You really can't say that if Oklahoma and Texas are in there. Now, Texas may not have its act together, and so they're going to beat you on signing day now, and you beat them on the field. But ultimately, I mean, if you really nail this hire, that program has a lot of potential. And I think you're going to get some young and hungry coaches. As you mentioned, Dykes, obviously Napier, I think has been linked to the job by a lot of outlets at this point. And probably even some more coaches we haven't heard of yet are likely inquiring about that gig. Have you been to TCU? Have you seen their facilities?
Yeah, I have. It's an impressive place, and the other thing that I think about recruiting wise is they did, in the Gary Patterson era, they did a really good job in Louisiana. Like there's no secondary market in Louisiana. You think about that, and Billy Napier's kind of done a really good job, kind of scraping the guys up that are kind of P5 fringe guys, but have height, weight, speed traits. And I think TCU kind of offers that place that makes a lot of sense. If you're not going to LSU, you're not going to Alabama, you're not going to one of these other SEC programs, there's a lot of value in that state of Louisiana that TCU has done a really good job in the past that I think would be attractive. And not to mention, there's something about being in the South and Louisiana and being in Texas where these kids, they want to stay home.
Yeah.
They much rather go to TCU than jump on a plane and go to Washington, which was always frustrating for us, being in a place in the Pacific Northwest where you feel like you're winning a lot of games and you're still losing battles to some of these secondary market teams in the Big 12. But that is just kind of the commonality down there, where if the product's going, and you've seen the way that Dykes has been recruiting at SMU, I mean, they're overachieving right now in terms of the guys that they're bringing to that campus. Jordan Hudson being one of those guys, who's committed to Oklahoma earlier in the process. And they're doing a really good job of just keeping guys home and saying, hey, you can get everything you want here at SMU. Imagine that at TCU at that level in the Big 12.
There's no doubt about it. Interesting question here related to the TCU gig from Adam Lee. Adam asks, hey, does a program that's almost single-handedly been elevated by one longtime head coach like Gary Patterson, make that a good job? Or I think another way to ask that here is, like, would that intimidate some coaches that only one guy has basically been able to make it work? Because he basically built the entire thing himself.
I think he did a really good job of elevating it. I mean, certainly that's why the job is where it is today. I mean, going from the Mountain West to the Big 12, making that transition, the long, sustainable run that he's had. But now that they've elevated to this stage, I think the job itself stands alone. And you look at the opportunities, and we've beaten this horse dead many times, but like, between being in the DFW and in the recruiting pool there in that state, and then now having the two biggest names in your conference leave for greener pastures, this is a huge opportunity for TCU to be ushered into a new era and make the right hire, and then hopefully have a guy that's going to be there in the long term.
They're not going to rip down those buildings when Patterson leaves the building, right? Like the buildings, all the fundraising work that he did, that stays. They're not going to move the city of Dallas just because Gary Patterson left. And I wouldn't say Gary Patterson and his staff are, amazing recruiters, right? I would say that like they did a good job recruiting to TCU, but I do think there is some meat left on the bone there as well. And if you look at the job they did recruiting, Coop in 2016, they were 21st, 2017, 28th, 2018, 25th. They had a 23rd in 2020. I mean, more often than not, they're pulling in fringe top 25 classes. If you get a guy in there who's a little bit better recruiter than Patterson and company, it's not crazy to think they could routinely pull classes in sort of that like 16 to 25 range. And if you do that in the new Big 12, you're cooking with gas, man.
Yeah, I think that's where they should be, 15 to kind of like 22 right there, and then outperform that. We've talked about it multiple times, but similar to Washington, I think both of these jobs can be elevated from a recruiting profile standpoint. And that's really going to be the key. And then obviously what you do between the white lines.
One thing I wanted to ask you about as far as making jobs more attractive is the new playoff plan, which instead of having, the 6 qualifiers based on ranking, it looks like they're looking more at auto bids for the Power 5 leagues, which would include the Big 12. The Big 12 certainly acted fast at a time when it was pretty vulnerable, right? Like they could have been seen as a non-Power 5 league without Oklahoma and without Texas. So they acted quickly, to add a UCF and Cincy in those schools. And it looks like with the new playoff proposal, assuming that gets passed eventually, which I think it probably will, that move will have paid off and will have cemented their P5 status. Like as a coach seeing that, how much does that matter to you that, hey, like we are in an auto bid league? If I win this league, I'm going to the playoff, which is probably contractual incentives and obviously bragging rights.
I mean, ask Luke Fickell that question. I mean, it's huge. This is a guy that I think has done a tremendous job in terms of upgrading that program and the roster composition. I know we talked about it, but I thought that Notre Dame-Cincinnati game was really evident in the job that Luke Fickell had done. And I just want to talk about Cincinnati because I don't think there's going to be another team outside of Cincinnati that's going to benefit from being a new addition to the Big 12 more than them. I think Luke Fickell has done a great job in terms of that tri-state area, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, in terms of recruiting Power 5 level talent. Now I think for them to be in a Power 5 conference, have the ability to win that conference, and then have a auto bid into the playoffs is huge. And I think that's going to do wonders for them and from a recruiting standpoint. And I think a lot of the other teams in the Big 12 have to start looking at it that way too.
No doubt about it. I mean, if you think about this, would you rather have had Iowa State? Would you rather have Cincinnati? I think some people could have debated this. Now, unless I'm missing something, if Cincinnati is a P5 job, which it is now, I think Cincinnati's a better job than like an Iowa State. And that's a huge step up for that program. It also gives Luke Fickell, if he does go out and look elsewhere, like if he does entertain USC or LSU or whomever else opens, it gives him great leverage. Because now whoever he's negotiating against can't say, hey, man, you're not going to stay at that G5 job forever, are you? You can say, look, It's a P5 gig. If I keep doing what I'm doing, I'm going to have basically I'm going to coast into the playoff every year. This is a nice place to be. I mean, I got to keep working hard, but yeah.
No, without a doubt. And I mean, like you look at Cincinnati and the reason he's probably sitting there, like we keep talking about Luke Fickell and why is he so rooted to this job in Cincinnati? Why is he so selective about his process? And I mean, outside of Ohio State and then Michigan, who's kind of been hit and miss in regards to recruiting, Michigan State now with the new coach and Mel Tucker, he's done a good job recently. But Coach Fickell has done a really good job living in that area where there's only been one program to really dominate it in Ohio. and they can't take everybody. Kentucky has kind of woken up to this too. Ohio is really an untapped resource in terms of recruiting. Kentucky started to take these guys and kind of migrated into that state. But Fickle's done a really good job kind of mining that territory for second-tier Power 5 players who are now seeing his vision and decided to enroll at Cincinnati.
No doubt about it. All right, guys. So take a break here. Make sure you have those questions still coming in here. Really appreciate Cooper Patagna, national recruiting analyst for 24/7 Sports, joining us on the college football lunchtime hangout. Appreciate you guys taking your lunch break with us. One day I'll probably learn to properly say the name of the show, which is, you can figure about a year. Probably should have done so. Anyway, keep those questions coming in the chat. After we talk about Texas A&M recruiting here, we'll go and answer a couple questions, and then we will go ahead and head on out of here. But Coop, Texas A&M having another fairly strong year on the field. Obviously lost quarterback Haynes King to an injury, maybe lost about a game or two more than they would have liked to, but it'll still be a nice year where they'll probably manage to win eight games, maybe 9 with the bowl. But the recruiting that A&M is doing this year is really sort of a shot across the bow for the rest of the country, and especially one for LSU, which is a direct competitor there in Texas and in Louisiana, and an elite recruiter in its own right. I just wanted to kind of run down what A&M is doing, where their class ranks, and maybe some guys it could close with, but also just the absolute freak athletes they have already in this thing.
Yeah, I mean so sitting at number 5 right now in the 247 Sports composite, number 3 in the SEC, just kind of shows the teeth of the SEC in terms of recruiting. But last week they go out and they get the number 2 player in the country in Walter Nolan, defensive lineman from Tennessee. Obviously a highly coveted guy, a guy who makes so much sense in that conference. And what it comes down to in that conference, and everybody knows this, is line of scrimmage play. And I think that's where A&M has gotten significantly better since Jimbo Fisher has joined there. Conor Wegman, another guy, we have him ranked number 32 in the top 247, a quarterback. It's kind of the crown jewel of that class, and I know we're going to talk about him earlier, but you keep going down the list. Bryce Anderson, Dion Bowie, Malik Silla, Le'Veon Moss this morning, P.J. Williams, another guy that they like as an offensive tackle. And then not to mention, they're in it with Evan Stewart, another top 5 ranked guy. And then Harold Perkins as well from Texas. This is legitimate top-end talent, national championship caliber type of classes that we are so used to seeing from Nick Saban and Kirby Smart year in after year. That's what A&M's doing right now. I don't know if people realize that. The biggest question for A&M is going to be, can they sustain this, especially when LSU gets back in the mix? They go and they take arguably the best back out of Louisiana this morning. Once LSU gets back in the mix, they're going to be a major player in this as well. Maybe Texas figures it out over there, and they're more of a player. But A&M doing what they have to do in terms of taking advantage when the fences are down, LSU going through some adversity, and they're doing a fantastic job. I can't say enough in terms of what they've done in recruiting this year, in terms of what they have left. Enai White, I didn't mention him, Shamar Stewart, some of these guys. If I could, like I said it this morning, if I could handcraft a class around top-end talent, it'd look a lot like what they got going right now.
Defensive line and quarterback, no doubt about it. I know I got to see Walter Nolan down there at the Future 50 event at Bradenton IMG, and just absolute stud. I did not get to see Albert Haynesworth in high school, obviously, but Coop, the way this guy is built, just the pictures don't do him justice. When you see him at the All-Star event, you're going to be, if you haven't already seen him in person, just he's freaky, man. He reminds me a little bit of like how he's built, at least like a Dexter Lawrence. He's just a guy that big should not be able to move that fast. And if you watch the clips of him at the end of that All-Star event, they lined him up not at nose, not at 3 tech. They lined him up playing like a 6-7 tech, and he dips the shoulder and beats a left tackle 2 out of 3 times, committed to LSU. A guy who's 3, what are we calling him? 325?
Yeah, 315, 320. Yeah, Will Campbell, committed to LSU out of Monroe. But, that was it. You look at the game tape and you say, okay. And then you look at the measurements, and then you're checking another box, like in terms of his size, his frame, how wide he is. I mean, I think it was over 350 at the UA Future 50 Combine.
Yeah.
And you go into that kind of scratching your head a little bit and say, okay, that's a little bit too heavy for me. And then you see him off the hoof and you're like, okay, he's carrying that weight well. And like you said, they lined him up everywhere. You know, as a 1 technique, as a 3 technique, as a 5 technique, going up against the best competition in the country. It didn't matter whether it was Will Campbell committed to LSU or Tyler Booker committed to Alabama. He dominated. You know, there was nobody better than him that day, which, you know, that's the fun part, getting to see the elite go up against each other. He dominated that day, and that's a big part of why he is where he is in the rankings. And for A&M to get a guy like that that's so highly coveted by the SEC, by Alabama, by Georgia, just kind of showing where they're going right now.
I mean, and that's the thing too, with when you dominate in a non-padded camp at 350 pounds with finesse moves and quickness off the edge, like that really makes it pop in a different way, because obviously if you're 350 and you're worth a damn, you're going to have the power game, right? And he can lean on people, but he wasn't bull rushing people. You know, he was taking a half man. He hit him with a rip. It was that was pretty impressive for sure. One thing I've been interested to see with the evolution of Jimbo's offense there at A&M is, can they start hitting explosive pass plays? So far, I think they've been like 99th, 97th, 103rd, and 97th in Bill Connolly's explosive pass rating in Jimbo's 4 years at Texas A&M. But it looks like help could really be on the way with some of the guys they have in this class. I mean, if you think that's more about the quarterback play than about the offensive scheme, what do you think about Conor Wegman and his ability to maybe help that offense to break out vertically down the field more?
Yeah, well, really like the player. Like, we were talking about this before the show, but he's a really good athlete, you know, and I think a lot of his game is based off of his athleticism, and he's a threat as a runner. So I really like him a lot, and as a passer, he's really good. So I think a big part of his evolution at the next level is going to be schematically how they use him and how Jimbo decides to use them. And I know we talk about it. Is that going to be Jimbo tailoring an offense around his skill set, or is that going to say, hey, these are the things that we like to do within our offense, we need you to match that? So I do think he gives a different element that A&M hasn't really had in terms of what he can do on the ground as a runner. And then he has a really intuitive game where he improvises really well as well. Really active passer outside of the pocket. I think that deep element that we talk about can exist. It's just going to be really a question of how they craft it.
That'll be so huge. If A&M adds that to this defensive line class and the defense they already have there with Mike Elko, that they really will be national championship caliber. I look at my stat screen and everything pretty much lights up in green, which is good, you know, and then I have this one little box and it's just deep red and it's explosive pass rating. I'm like, man, if they could ever find a way to hit explosive pass plays, there's no real difference between like this team in Alabama or a Georgia or an Ohio State on a game-to-game basis. So that'd be absolutely huge for them.
Yeah, you got to remember too, like Evan Stewart would play a huge part of that.
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, an extremely dynamic player in terms of what he can do, take the top off the defense. Then the other guy that, you know, I didn't even mention earlier, Chris Marshall. I mean, this guy's only been playing football for 2 years, you know, committed to A&M. We have him now in the top 40, one of the best pass catching receivers, jump ball 50-50 guys in the country. So certainly a lot to be excited about. And when you have guys like that, that just decreases the margin of error for a quarterback like Conor Wegman. So I'm sure Jimbo is excited and thinking the same thing.
One more guy I wanted to ask you about is Malik Silla. Remember, like 2 years ago at 24/7 Sports, when we started to dive in on the 2022 kids, they gave me defensive ends, and I was really excited about the defensive end class in the state of Texas, because the year before we didn't really have a great DN class in Texas. And I was like, man, you got this kid is he still at Katy, I believe?
Yeah,
I remember when I watched him first, like, this guy's got some frame. He could play with some leverage, and yet you also look at him and say, I mean, he might be able to put on some serious weight. That'll be interesting to see how they deploy him in that 3-down system they run there. Do you see him more as like a stand-up hybrid guy, or more as like a dude they try to get to 275, 280 and play hand in the dirt?
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations about this. He has exceptional length. I don't see him. He's a really good athlete, but in terms of playing in a 2-point and playing off the edge, I don't see that for him. I see him in a 3-point stance, playing in a 3 technique, 285 pounds. I mean, this guy has 37-inch arms, which would put him in the top 10% of all NFL starters at his position. So I think those are, don't quote me on it, but it'd probably be top 3 longest arms in this class. So what that means is he's got a lot of growing to do, a lot of development to do. I see him with his hand in the dirt, but I think they can deploy him a lot of different ways. And the fact that we haven't even talked about him kind of says a lot about what A&M's doing right now.
For sure. Man, A&M is building an absolute monster of a class there. We'll see if they can close it out with an Evan Stewart and a couple other guys down the stretch. But no doubt about it that they are building a national championship foundation there in College Station. If they can sustain this, as you mentioned, obviously LSU probably not going to be down forever with a coaching hire coming up for those guys as well. Coop, final thing before we get to listener questions here, I wanted to ask you about this. And this year, coaches really didn't have to face this problem because they had relief on the roster for the super seniors who came back due to COVID. You could basically carry unlimited number of guys, provided that that you were using that. Excuse me, for the like if you're a super senior, you're able to come back and not count against the 85 cap due to COVID. This year we won't have that. And so a lot of these schools out there are going to have to make some difficult decisions. How do we keep this guy on our roster? How do we kind of decide to tell this guy to move on? Sorry. We'll edit this in post, I guess, except for the fact we're live too. But for the BODs, this won't be in there. Like, how do you go about the process of recruiting somebody off your roster? Like, that's got to be a weird conversation, especially if he's somebody maybe like other kids on the team like.
Yeah, I mean, that's a super delicate and thoughtful process, which I think it's more that happens. It's not one conversation, which that can certainly be the case, but I think it's a conversation that happens over time. And you're starting to paint that picture for that player. Say, hey, look, we have a new freshman that came in. He's obviously playing very well. This is kind of what we see in terms of our game plan in the future, in terms of how we're splitting carries at a position, how we're splitting reps, or whatever it is. And you start to really kind of paint that picture so he starts to understand. So I think, you kind of plant a seed. And then, look, I've been places where you're just ripping the Band-Aid off, where you just say, hey, look, we'll find you a home. Truth of the matter is you're not going to play here, and that's the reality of the industry sometimes. It really kind of depends on who you're working for and how they see it and how they see those conversations going. But it's still completely up to the player in terms of whether or not they want to come back for another year eligibility, whether they want to play or not. And I think that's really important. So I think every player is going to have a different focus on, hey, it's really important for me that I get my degree from this school and I want to finish out here. And this is important. I want to see this through, even if I don't play, if I'm not on the field. Or if I'm not going to play, then I need to go find a place where I can go showcase my talent. But I don't think there's one proven way of doing it. I do think it's just kind of more of a timeline approach, just depending on the coach.
Coop, kind of the other side of this coin, I know this is kind of a new thing, but with the transfer portal era, we are having to recruit the kids who are already on our roster repeatedly. Like, if you have a guy who you guys still believe in as a staff, but who there's not really a clear path to immediate playing time, how does that conversation go?
Yeah, I think that's a little tough. I think that's a new territory for a lot of coaches, and it really depends on like the head coach. I know I keep saying that, but like if you have a head coach who's very aware, very understanding of the roster and understanding of the conversations that had taken place during the recruiting process, not only with the prospect himself, but with the family and the decision makers in that process, then there's a lot of finessing in terms of how that goes. And even, to the point where like you see Oregon play a lot of these freshmen, they rotate a lot of bodies and a lot of these guys are getting in games, and that's important for them. Like, people might not think that way, but if they have a big lead going in the second half, they're going to get guys on the field because that's what they believe in. That's the message in terms of getting people to Oregon, is that you're going to play and you're going to play early. And to Coach Cristobal's credit, he does a really good job of kind of seeing that through. Other places, some places aren't like that. Like, you have to earn it, but you also have to say, okay, with that message, you have to understand that there's an easy opt-out option for these players where they don't even have to talk to you. All they have to do is make compliance aware that they want to leave, and that's it, and they're out of there.
So it's kind of a constant temperature check, right? Hey, where do we think this kid's headspace is? And that's got to be part of your recruiting meetings now as well. Like recruiting your own roster. Who do we think definitely will leave? Who could leave? Do we have backup options for this? Have we talked? Like I know he's not getting the snap count. We probably hope that he would because we're not winning as many blowouts this year. That's a really, really delicate dance that those guys have to do for sure. And like in addition to, scouting other teams' rosters for potential transfer portal guys, hey, maybe this kid wants to come back to his home state. There's also that element that we have of having to keep kids on our own roster. Here's an interesting one for you, very coaching industry related, also somewhat recruiting related. This is from Pete Milano. He says, hey, Coop, do you think some top assistants like Mike Elko, who makes like $2 million a year, have priced themselves out of some head coaching gigs?
That's a great question. I mean, depending on where the job is, for sure. I mean, $2 million is so much money. Like I was looking at salaries when I was doing research of some of the guys that we were going to talk about, whether it's TCU or Washington, and you look at some of these mid-level salaries of some of these group of 5 coaches, a lot of these guys aren't touching a mill. So you look at a guy like Mike Elko in a situation that he's in, he's making $2 million. Aranda, similar situation for him when he was at LSU, about the same. So I think, yes, it's depending on the job, but it shows the patience that these guys have to have in terms of making themselves available for a job, or the step down that they're going to have to take from a salary standpoint to really go pursue the head coaching option that I'm sure for a lot of these guys is something that they've all wanted to do. Now, like perfect situation would be like a Dave Aranda leaving LSU to go to a place like Baylor, but that doesn't always happen. So yeah, for sure. I think that's a legitimate point.
I think this is one of the reasons why we are not seeing quite as many P5 coordinators leave for G5 jobs now. It used to be, hey, awesome, you've shown you can recruit at the P5 level. You've shown you can be a coordinator. As an AD, I want to see you can go run your own show for a year or two, go take a Toledo, go take a South Alabama or, a Louisiana like Napier did, obviously, and show me that you can be the head man, because it is a different gig, being the head guy than it is being a coordinator. But a lot of these guys now just do not want to leave the P5 and are much more willing to just stay. And part of it is, the money. I mean, you're making $2 million.
Right.
Mike Elko, he will get a head coaching job at some point, I'm sure, if he wants it, but he's set for life now, coaching for A&M there. If he did, like, financially, his family, his kids are set up really forever without ever having to go and be the head man. This also really impacts the head coaching pool in the G5. If you're like, hey, I can go pull this guy who's a good assistant or, good coordinator at Tennessee or South Carolina. Not anymore, man. Like I talked to a lot of these G5 programs, and they think this is a real issue for them talent pool wise.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's going to be fascinating. I mean, like, you look at Brent Venables, who's kind of the standard for that, right? I mean, that's the guy who kind of laid it out. You look at what he's getting paid. I'm not even sure what he's getting paid, but I would assume it's over $2 million right now. And you look at Mike Elko, and it's like, why would I leave if I don't have this burning desire to go be a head coach?
And I get Coach Walter Nolan.
Right? Exactly. The guys that coming in defensively and what Jimbo's now building at Texas A&M. And you have something that not a lot of people have, and you're also being paid very well for it, and that's job security, and that is really hard to find. So when you're getting paid $2 million, you're competing in the best football in the country. I think that makes it a little bit harder to leave.
For sure. This one from Adam Lee is one I want to kind of clarify, and then we can expand on a little bit. So he asks, do we know what exceptions the NCAA will be making for scholarship numbers over the next few years due to COVID? Yeah, none. As far as the actual total roster size, as far as I understand it, right? Everybody's got to be back down to the 85 this year. Last year, like they said, everybody gets an extra year and the seniors don't count against the cap. This year, everybody gets an extra year, but you do count against the cap. So from what I've been talking to schools, they're saying, yeah, you get that extra year, but we don't have to give it to you here. You know what I mean? Like if you can find some place to take you, go on ahead.
Yeah. I mean, like, drove me crazy. You kind of overseeing a roster, the 85 plus the 25 with the walk-ons, and you're trying to figure out, getting a pulse for what the NCAA is doing, and none of it makes sense, So it's going to be super fascinating kind of how, these schools and these programs navigate this as they go forward. I mean, especially getting the extra year of eligibility for all the guys that you just signed. I mean, I don't know. I mean, these guys are going to have their hands full with that, and that's certainly going to be something that we need to keep an eye on as it goes forward.
The only real, I guess, if you want, Adam, if you want to call it an exception, is the +7 transfer rule that they passed. Uh, Now it doesn't help you with the 85 at all. It's really just an initial counter issue, as far as I understand it. But if you sign a full class of 25 uh, high schoolers, then for every transfer you have leave the program, I believe after the end of this semester, you can take up to one transfer who doesn't, like, basically extend your initial counter cap from 25 to like 32. And so you can squeeze those guys in there. So that is sort of their little half measure if you have guys leave after the semester. However, as far as I understand it, and I could be wrong, but from the schools I talk to, if you have a guy leave right now, it doesn't count. They have to be leaving after the year, which is maybe a little bit of poor rule drafting on the NCAA's part. Because I think if you have a guy leave in November, that should be able to free up a spot for you, come signing day, for sure. That's just my take on that, I guess.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I mean, like, I can go and talk about this stuff all day, man. I mean,
Dude, our fans will nerd out on it. What bothered you the most, or what was like the most pain in the ass thing about managing a roster?
I mean, that right there were so many different things. I mean, like, me shooting you straight, I was just such like a black and white guy. I had people surrounded by me who were very good in terms of NCAA knowledge, in terms of roster knowledge. We met with compliance extensively. But it was more like, tell me what we need to get done, we'll get it done. Because to me, the rule changes every week, and I can't keep up with it.
I mean, the value of a good compliance lawyer in one of those departments who can figure out how to get things done under the rules is pretty important.
Yeah, getting them to work with you, that's a completely different conversation.
Yeah. And certain schools have different reps, obviously,
No
than others do, as far as compliance and friendliness. Last one here from where I can't find the question on here, but basically the question was, who are some recently let go, guys from staffs, be they head coaches or assistants, who you think will be highly desirable in the coordinator market from this cycle so far?
Yeah, I'll kind of let you lead this one off. I mean, the only one that like I would have to take a temperature check on right now would be Gary Patterson.
Yeah.
I would think that one of these jobs open, whether it's an LSU or a USC, could look at a guy like that and say, okay, that makes a lot of sense, especially in terms of bringing in a new coach where it's going to make you feel a lot better about the guy coming in defensively. So that's the first name that I think of. I look at a couple of these other jobs that maybe, Jimmy Lake, obviously at Washington, crafted that reputation as one of the best defensive back coaches in the country. I think that's going to be more important for him to kind of stay within that geographical region. Whether or not he's going to get another shot as a defensive coordinator or not will be interesting. But at least if you're one of these top tier programs, especially on the West Coast, he'd be one of my first calls in terms of bringing in as a defensive back presence and the job that he's done from a developmental standpoint. So I look at those two. Those are definitely the first couple guys. And then Rolovich, I know it's like a circus with the Washington State thing, man, but he's a really good offensive mind. I could see him getting a call somewhere.
For sure. I mean, there's a lot of places, some in the South that don't have the same requirements. So if the president's cool with hiring him, obviously could get another gig. I would point to Durante Jones, actually. LSU has lost a ton of guys for long term on the defensive side of the ball, personnel wise. But man, in the last month or so, they are running different stuff. They look a hell of a lot better. I think Durante Jones, I mean, understandably so, it took him a little while to get things going there, but they gave Alabama hell. I was very impressed with how they handled that Kendall Briles offense at Arkansas. If Durante Jones wants to stay in the college game, Coop, I mean, you obviously, you're an LSU guy, or, from there. What have you watched what they've been doing the last month? It seems like they're playing a hell of a lot better.
I have, yeah, and he's done an exceptional job. I think that's probably a conversation, and I'm sure Scott Woodward's very aware of that in terms of what they're paying Durante and how much that would be a benefit in terms of being able to keep a guy on like that. So I'd be interested to see kind of what the pulse is in the locker room, how the players feel about him. Obviously, I haven't heard anything negative, but those guys have been playing well, especially, that was kind of like an eye-opening performance against Alabama. They followed up with a really good performance against Arkansas. They're extremely talented on that side. They just haven't had a lot of consistency since Dave Aranda left. And ironically enough, if Dave Aranda were to make a comeback to LSU, I could see definitely a situation where Durante Jones sticks. And I think that's going to be a conversation for anybody who takes that job.
For sure. Another name I'll throw out there just on the coordinator side, who I don't think will have difficulty landing on his feet, Graham Harrell. USC has done a pretty good job scouting out QBs. The offense there is not generally considered to be the problem. Maybe a lack of physicality at times with some of the offensive line development, but I think his star was pretty hot when he got to USC, and I think it'll still be fairly attractive for some program out there for sure. Look what Western Kentucky's doing this year, basically importing the entire Houston Baptist offense, and they may end up winning the CUSA. He's a guy I could see really doing pretty well. I'm trying to think other Gary Patterson's an obvious one. I do think that Fuente, by the way, is respected as an offensive mind and as a guy who can develop offense and scheme. Like, it wouldn't shock me, maybe not as an OC immediately, but it wouldn't shock me to see him go to one of these major programs and be an analyst type coach for them. His offensive line development at Vatech was really pretty strong and consistent, and that is something a lot of programs they struggle with. So I could see him landing on his feet there in that kind of role. His issue was kind of always recruiting, right? And they just weren't getting players. They were in the 40s and 50s more often than not in recruiting class wise. So
what do you think? What do you think happens with him in terms of, is he going to be a head coach next year? Is he going to be play caller like you mentioned? Or
I think it depends on where, like which place opens, right? There were some people saying, hey, maybe TCU, but I don't think TCU would do that, right? I think TCU can get somebody who's a little bit hotter right now. I don't know that Fuente's a bad coach. I think it's kind of a tough situation to take over there. And then he kept Bud Foster. I have no idea, if that was something that was going to be, if that was forced on him, kind of like Muschamp having to take Charlie Weiss, or, if it was something that was more like, I want to keep Bud Foster because he's a legend. It just never really seemed to work out there. And they really did struggle in recruiting. So maybe if he goes and works for somebody who is known as a really organized recruiter, somebody who emphasizes recruiting a whole lot, and maybe coaches O-line, maybe a run game coordinator. He did some really nice run game stuff when he was at TCU, under Gary. It wouldn't shock me to see him land at one of these major programs, maybe as an O-line coach or as a coordinator. Or a lot of these guys just take a step back a year. They be an analyst somewhere. They learn a little bit, and then they're back in the game like Butch Jones did.
Yeah, I think about that with Barry Odom.
Yeah.
I mean, you kind of look at his stock and, 2 years at Arkansas with Pitt. And, now he's going to be a guy that I'm sure will actually probably be in the mix at Virginia Tech, So I think that can do a lot. I think it just really kind of depends on the person, if they have the ego or the lack of ego to be able to step aside and say, hey, I kind of need to go look at this through a different lens. What is it that I need to do different? And you look at Fuente, and this is really kind of my outlook on a lot of these guys, like Justin Fuente can coach, Chip Kelly can coach, but there's so many different aspects that come into the picture in terms of building and sustaining a successful program. And it's a lot of the stuff that a lot of these guys just don't want to do, or generally haven't had to do at a different level before.
Which is exactly the reason that some of these ADs wanted to see these guys who are, like we just had this discussion 5 minutes ago, right? We know you've been a successful coordinator at the P5 level. Go be a head coach at a G5 school for a year or two to show me you can do it. Now, a lot of those guys don't want to leave those really high paying, P5 coordinator roles, so that they get in these jobs for the first time. And sometimes it works out great, but other times there's a lot of new elements that you just can't simulate being a coordinator. And it's a new experience for them for sure. I think Odom's fascinating, by the way, Coop, because we as a sport have got to get to, hiring practice wise, away from things like total yards. If you're the DC for Kendall Briles, if you're an AD out there and you're smarter than the other ADs, you can look at it and say, wait a second, they have to defend 15 possessions a game. Their per possession efficiency numbers, almost like basketball has gone to, are really damn good. If you look at their total yards, not that great. But who cares? I mean, if my offense is getting the ball 15 times, it's really what am I doing per possession? What's my red zone efficiency, right? What's my EPA? Numbers that are a little more, if not tempo free, tempo controlled. And I do think that's sort of a stigma that some of these D coordinators who take these jobs opposite of a tempo air raid or Baylor style OC get, that makes it hard for them to get head coach jobs because their numbers are never going to measure up to somebody who runs a very slow offense. To take it back to Elko, I mean, A&M is routinely in the bottom 10 in offensive pace on an annual basis. Elko is a damn good DC. His efficiency numbers are great. So, that's not the issue. His total yards numbers are off the chart because they only have to defend the ball like 10 times a game.
Right. What's the average possession, offensive possession throughout the game?
I think it's like 13 or 14.
13.
Yeah. I basically I have my own tempo ratings that I make, and it's kind of proprietary, but like Army, Minnesota, a couple of those schools are at like the very, very bottom, obviously, schools that run the ball all the time, but also take forever to snap it. And at the top, it's kind of the schools you'd figure, right? Tennessee with Heupel, Ole Miss with Kiffin, SMU's fairly up there. Kent State, now that they're in a MAC play, is like super fast, flash fast, all that type of stuff. And then, a lot of your national title contenders are kind of in the middle. They're not generally bottom 20, top 20 for the most part.
Right.
So, hey, man, really appreciate you coming on here. We went almost an hour. That was awesome. Guys, follow Cooper Patagna at cpatagna247 on Twitter. Awesome content. We got new rankings coming out. Man, I know you guys have put a ton of effort into that. Cooper will be back on. You want to do this again next week?
Let's do it, man.
All right,
Let's do it. Enjoyed it.
I'm down. Appreciate the comment section. Thanks for taking y'all's lunch break with us. And make sure to tune in this evening. I think it's at like 8-ish probably. We have the college football playoff rankings reaction show live on this YouTube channel, which means we're going live 3 times today, guys. Already did the Virginia Tech one this morning. So gonna go rest, save the voice, and I'll see y'all later tonight. What the hell? Let's see this. What is it doing? All right, so I think we can exit out of this. It's not letting me end it, but when I exit out, like if we both exit out, it'll end. Cool. Appreciate it, dude.
All right, man.
All right.